Imagine holding the digital pulse of a billion-dollar freight empire, only for a new executive to ask if you are the server room cleaner. They decided my role was obsolete, assuming some flashy software could replace 10 years of custom algorithms built to navigate strict federal laws. I simply packed my desk, left the compliance keys exactly where they demanded, and enjoyed a sunny Miami vacation while all 4,000 of their trucks were locked down nationwide. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. I want to sincerely thank all of you for being here, but unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon, where you can listen to exclusive, true stories that are even better, much longer, and feature incredibly detailed situations we cannot make public on YouTube, all performed by multiple emotional voice actors. You can join by simply scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the Patreon link in the video description or the pinned comment. Now, let us dive right into today's story about how I, Stella Chavez, quietly orchestrated the downfall of the executives who thought they could throw me away. I am 38 years old, and until recently, I served as the chief logistics routing architect at Etherian Freight Solutions, a massive corporate freight entity headquartered right in the bustling steel and glass heart of downtown Chicago. For the better part of a decade, my entire professional life was passionately dedicated to ensuring that the invisible veins of American commerce kept pumping without a single interruption. Transporting hazardous materials across state lines is absolutely nothing like delivering a simple box of shoes or basic consumer electronics. It is an intensely complicated logistical minefield. Every single one of the 50 states has its own ever-changing labyrinth of severe environmental taxes, strict weight limits, rigid safety permits, and highly localized municipal transportation restrictions. Missing a single permit does not just mean a minor corporate fine. It means federal agents physically impounding transport trucks on the side of the highway and forcibly shutting down our operations. To handle this absolute chaos, I spent years building a custom artificial intelligence system from the ground up. I called it the Pulse. It was my absolute masterpiece. The Pulse was a highly specialized, self-updating network that constantly analyzed federal and state regulations, legally maneuvering our hazardous freight through bureaucratic roadblocks with surgical precision. Because of my proprietary system, Etherion saved tens of millions of dollars in potential compliance fines every single year and routed heavy freight much faster than any of our biggest industry competitors. The system was profoundly complex, but it was flawless. I was the ghost in the machine, the quiet, unseen architect keeping the entire company legally compliant and highly profitable, while the executives upstairs constantly patted themselves on the back and collected their massive end-of-year bonus checks. Then came the grand disruption. The board of directors suddenly decided our company needed a modern corporate facelift, which meant bringing in a brand new vice president of operations. His name was Brad Vance, a textbook tech bro imported straight from the sunny echo chambers of Silicon Valley. Brad was the kind of guy who wore immaculate designer sneakers with expensive tailored suits, drank overpriced green detox smoothies, and spoke entirely in empty corporate buzzwords. Like synergy and disruption, he was fiercely obsessed with automating absolutely everything, ruthlessly cutting employee headcount, and maximizing immediate quarterly profits to inflate his own personal performance metrics. To him, anything that was not a sleek, outsourced, cloud-based subscription service was a glaring liability. He did not understand the rugged freight industry, and he most certainly did not understand federal compliance laws. Our very first encounter perfectly set the toxic tone for everything that followed. It happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, down in the notoriously loud local server room. I was down on the floor, physically rerouting some thick network cables to optimize our internal data flow. I had grease on my hands and a little dust on my knees. The heavy metal door swung open, and Brad walked in, typing furiously on his expensive tablet. He stopped, looked down at me, and his face twisted into a mask of pure condescension. He actually thought I was a low-level inventory clerk or someone hired to clean the hardware. "Excuse me, are you almost done cleaning those wires? I need the information technology manager in here right now to prep for a massive software migration," he said, not even bothering to make eye contact with me. I slowly stood up, wiped my hands on my jeans, and calmly introduced myself as the Chief Logistics Routing Architect. For a fraction of a second, he actually looked embarrassed, but that quickly morphed into an arrogant, punchable smirk. Brad looked around the humming server racks and let out a highly theatrical sigh. "Right, the architect," he said, literally using air quotes with his fingers. "I have been reviewing your routing software, the Pulse. Look, no offense, but it is a bulky relic. We are aggressively moving toward an agile, lean ecosystem. I am replacing your messy legacy system with a generic, outsourced software as a service platform. It will cut our operational overhead by 40% and completely eliminate the need for heavy in-house maintenance." He was talking about replacing a highly specialized federal compliance engine with a cheap, off-the-shelf, routing application meant for delivering basic retail goods. It was nothing short of corporate suicide. The sheer, unadulterated ignorance it took to confidently suggest such a thing was genuinely staggering. He looked at me, standing there waiting for me to get defensive, eagerly waiting for me to argue for my job or beg him to understand the vital value of my hard work. But I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or attempt to educate him on the lethal, unforgiving complexities of hazardous material transport laws. Instead, I just looked right at him, silently memorizing every single foolish word he just spewed. I carefully watched his absolute arrogance override any trace of logical leadership. In corporate America, quiet competence is often punished while loud. Confident stupidity is handsomely rewarded. I knew right then and there that Ethereum Freight Solutions had just dug its own grave, and Brad Vance had happily handed me the shovel. I smiled politely, nodded my head, and walked out of the server room in total silence, my mind already calculating the exact trajectory of their impending spectacular collapse. The restructuring meeting took place on a Monday morning inside the grand glass boardroom overlooking the sprawling city skyline. Over 50 top executives and department heads were gathered around the long mahogany table. Brad Vance stood at the front of the room, a massive digital presentation illuminating his smug face. He proudly announced the new operational matrix, speaking in endless circles about agile methodologies and leaning out the workforce. Then, he finally got to my department. He paused, letting a cold, predatory grimace spread across his face. "Stella Chavez," he announced loudly to the crowded room, making sure every single person was looking at me. "We are transitioning you to a new role as partner support specialist." The entire room went completely dead silent. Everyone in that building knew I built the logistical backbone that kept the company alive. Brad continued, his voice dripping with a sickening, mock sympathy. "Let us be entirely honest. Stella, at your age, clinging to those outdated lines of code is just holding our progress back. It is time you learn how to answer the phones, manage partner complaints, and let the new generation handle the actual technology." He publicly stripped away my administrative access to the network right then and there. My life's work, a highly sensitive compliance engine, was casually handed over to a team of 4 fresh college interns who looked like they had never read a federal statute in their entire lives. They were incredibly cheap labor, hired solely to make the quarterly budget look good, completely oblivious to the crushing weight of national transport laws. I sat motionless in my ergonomic chair, feeling the intense, awkward stares of my colleagues burning into the side of my face. In the past, this kind of brutal public humiliation would have shattered my confidence or sent me into a screaming rage. But sitting there under the harsh fluorescent lights, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold. Calculating clarity, the final thread of my corporate loyalty snapped without a sound. Quietly severing 10 years of relentless dedication, I understood exactly what was happening. My original employment contract included a massive severance package of nearly $500,000 if I was ever terminated without just cause. The company absolutely did not want to write that check. Instead, Brad was weaponizing workplace isolation and psychological pressure against me. It was a classic corporate siege strategy known as quiet firing. They wanted to strip me of my dignity, reduce my daily responsibilities to answering angry customer phone calls, and suffocate my career until I broke down and handed in my resignation voluntarily. They wanted me to quit, so I decided to give them exactly what they desired. But on my own devastating terms, I returned to my small cubicle and immediately began executing my exit strategy. I did not sabotage a single piece of software. I did not delete any important files or write malicious computer viruses. True revenge in the corporate world does not require illegal hacking. It only requires a masterful understanding of standard operating procedures. Instead of fighting back, I quietly initiated the official standard handover protocol. Over the next 3 days, I meticulously exported every single federal permitting process, every state tax algorithm, and the master federal encryption tokens required to keep our freight trucks legally on the highway. I routed all of this highly classified, vital information to the high-speed office printer. I gathered hundreds of pages of dense legal text, complex routing logic, and encrypted alphanumeric keys, binding them all together into a colossal, incredibly heavy hardcover manual. Hidden deep within that massive mountain of boring paperwork was the absolute heart of the trap. 3 years ago, during a severe federal compliance audit, the legal department of our company approved a strict security protocol to prevent unauthorized access to our hazardous materials network. I was the one who designed it, and they eagerly signed off on it. It was a biometric failsafe. The system was deeply hardwired to require my specific fingerprint and retinal scan every 14 days. If the senior rights holder failed to authenticate within that precise 2-week window, the system assumed a catastrophic security breach had occurred. Upon missing the deadline, the software would automatically disconnect from the master grid and immediately send an automated invalidation report to the United States Department of Transportation, instantly freezing every single active hazardous transport license under our corporate umbrella. The sheer brilliance of the trap lay in its total legality. The fail-safe was not a malicious bug. It was a legally documented safety feature, heavily vetted and fully approved by the most expensive lawyers in our building. The only possible way to override the 14-day countdown was to manually input the master federal encryption tokens to transfer the senior administrative rights to a new user account, and those exact tokens were now neatly printed inside the gigantic, extremely boring hardcover manual sitting plainly on my desk. I looked at the massive book and smiled a genuine smile. I knew the culture of this company better than anyone else alive. I knew Brad Vance and his entire team of arrogant executives. In this building, nobody had the attention span to read a technical document longer than 3 pages. They wanted sleek digital dashboards and colorful pie charts, not heavy paper manuals filled with endless walls of text. I was handing them the literal keys to their own survival, securely wrapped in the one thing they despised most, which was tedious, analog hard work. The trap was perfectly set in plain sight, waiting for them to step right into it with their eyes wide open. Exactly 14 days before the biometric failsafe would execute its fatal countdown, I printed my formal letter of resignation. The timing was absolutely crucial. Every single second was meticulously calculated, like the intricate interlocking gears of a vintage Swiss watch. I walked across the massive open floor plan of the operations department, my footsteps completely muffled by the expensive gray corporate carpet. I headed straight toward the glass-walled corner office belonging to the new vice president of operations. Brad Vance was leaning back in his high-end ergonomic leather chair, intensely focused on a brightly colored, utterly meaningless pie chart on his digital tablet. Outside his glass walls, the 4 fresh interns he had assigned to my department were laughing loudly, watching a viral video on their phones, blissfully unaware of the federal compliance monster they were supposedly managing. I stepped through the open door and placed the single, crisp white sheet of paper squarely in the center of his pristine glass desk. Brad looked up, clearly annoyed by the unannounced interruption. until his eyes scanned the bold heading of the document. A slow, deeply self-satisfied smirk stretched across his face, lighting up his eyes with sheer arrogance. He actually thought he had won the war. In his mind, his ruthless, calculating strategy of quiet firing had worked perfectly. He believed he had successfully bullied the obsolete legacy engineer out of his futuristic, agile ecosystem without having to pay a single dime in corporate severance packages. Brad grabbed a silver fountain pen and signed my clearance and offboarding papers so fast he practically tore the page in half. He did not ask a single question about the current transition status. He did not request a briefing on the interns he had blindly assigned to manage the hazmat network. He did not even ask if there were any pending government deadlines. He was just eagerly rushing to process the paperwork and formally erase my presence from the corporate payroll, completely blinded by his own toxic ego. "Before I leave this building for good," I said, ensuring my voice remained perfectly level and entirely devoid of any emotion, "I have to officially transfer the administrative controls to you as my direct superior." I reached into my sturdy canvas tote bag and pulled out the colossal, heavy hardcover manual I had painstakingly assembled over the past few days. It landed on his glass desk with a heavy, deeply satisfying thud that actually made his half-empty coffee cup rattle against its saucer. I pointed directly at the massive black binder, making sure to maintain unbroken eye contact. "Brad, you need to listen to me very carefully right now. This book contains the physical backup of the master federal encryption tokens. It holds the complete, step-by-step procedural architecture for every single hazardous transport permit we maintain across all 50 states. Without the specific alphanumeric codes printed inside this manual, the company absolutely cannot legally verify its active federal licenses. This physical document is the only thing keeping the entire transportation system running legally under United States Department of Transportation regulations. You must update the senior biometric credentials using this exact guide, or the system will lock you out." Brad stared at the massive block of paper like I had just placed a pile of rotting garbage on his pristine desk. He let out a loud, condescending laugh, shaking his head at the sheer volume of the printed words. "Stella, this right here is exactly why you are leaving," he mocked, tapping his sleek tablet with a manicured finger. "We do not do paper anymore. Everything is migrating to the cloud. I will just have the interns scan whatever is somewhat important next month when they have some free time between their other projects." Then, in a moment of pure, unadulterated irony that felt almost too brilliantly perfect to be real, Brad picked up the most critical legal document in the entire history of Ethereum Freight Solutions. He complained out loud that his neck had been hurting from looking down at his screen all week. He shoved my master compliance manual right under the base of his ultra-wide computer monitor, proudly admiring his makeshift ergonomic adjustment. He was literally using the federal survival keys of a billion-dollar logistics empire as a cheap monitor stand. I did not blink. I did not offer a single word of correction or warning. I simply nodded my head, politely wished him the absolute best of luck with his impending cloud migration, and walked out of his office. I returned to my small cubicle for the very last time. I had one final, critical chess piece to place on the board to ensure my absolute protection. I drafted a highly detailed, legally binding email addressed directly to the chief legal officer and the head of corporate compliance. The message explicitly stated that I had formally surrendered all federal administrative rights, biometric safety protocols, and master encryption tokens directly into the physical possession of Vice President Brad Vance. I attached a scanned digital copy of his signed acknowledgement form. I set the corporate outbox server to automatically send that exact email at precisely 5 o'clock in the afternoon, right at the exact moment my building access badge would automatically deactivate. I packed my few personal belongings into a small cardboard box. There were no sad goodbyes. There were no dramatic final speeches to my coworkers. I just walked straight to the main elevator, rode it down to the ground floor lobby, and stepped out into the crisp, cool Chicago air. I tossed my corporate identification badge directly into a nearby trash can on the sidewalk. I got into my car and drove straight to the international airport. By the time my scheduled email silently landed in the legal department inboxes, completely clearing me of any future liability, I was already sitting comfortably in a spacious first-class seat. I was drinking a cold glass of champagne, watching the glittering city lights disappear below me as the airplane banked south toward the sunny, vibrant beaches of Miami. The invisible trap was permanently locked. The countdown was steadily ticking, and there was absolutely nothing left for me to do but enjoy the beautiful weather. Exactly 14 days after I walked out of that glass building, the silent, digital time bomb I left behind finally reached zero. It was a beautiful Tuesday morning. I was lying on a pristine white sand beach in Miami, listening to the gentle crash of the ocean waves, completely detached from the frantic corporate world. But over 1,000 miles away in the heart of Chicago, all hell was breaking loose. Right at the stroke of 9 o'clock in the morning, the biometric failsafe embedded deep within the pulse initiated its final, ruthless security sweep. It scoured the main server architecture for my specific fingerprint and retinal scan. It found absolutely nothing, operating precisely as the company lawyers had originally mandated and approved. The software instantly assumed a catastrophic unauthorized data breach had occurred. In less than 3 seconds, the system executed the ultimate emergency lockdown protocol. It automatically severed its connection to the master freight grid and fired an encrypted, unalterable invalidation signal directly to the United States Department of Transportation servers. In the blink of an eye, the legal digital permits for every single hazardous transport vehicle operating under the Ethereum corporate umbrella were aggressively and permanently revoked. The immediate fallout was nothing short of a nationwide logistical apocalypse. Out on the vast interstate highways spanning all 50 states, Department of Transportation way stations simultaneously erupted in flashing red warnings. Government terminals locked up entirely, displaying severe critical compliance violations for our entire commercial fleet. Within the very first hour, local highway patrols, state troopers, and federal transport inspectors began aggressively pulling over our drivers. Exactly 4,000 massive freight trucks were abruptly ordered to pull off the road, park on the shoulders, and immediately shut off their engines. The drivers were completely baffled, standing in the dust on the side of the highway, holding company-issued digital tablets that suddenly displayed nothing but deactivated legal credentials and blaring warning symbols. This was not a simple, inconvenient delivery delay of basic consumer electronics or retail clothing. This was a catastrophic, highly dangerous halt of heavily regulated materials. Hundreds of reinforced refrigerated trailers carrying volatile, incredibly temperature-sensitive pharmaceutical chemicals were suddenly stranded under the blazing summer sun in Texas and Nevada, their cooling units burning through precious diesel fuel with nowhere to go. Massive, armored tankers filled with highly corrosive industrial acids and flammable gases were physically impounded at various state borders, strictly forbidden by armed authorities from moving a single inch further. With every passing minute, the financial damage multiplied exponentially. The company was instantly hemorrhaging millions of dollars per hour in severe federal delay penalties, massive spoiled hazardous cargo claims, and astronomical contract violation fees from furious clients. Back at the corporate headquarters in downtown Chicago, the atmosphere quickly devolved into sheer, unadulterated panic. The massive open floor plan, usually filled with the quiet, organized hum of productivity, transformed into a deafening war zone of relentlessly ringing telephones, shouting dispatchers, and screaming supervisors. The massive digital tracking screens mounted on the walls, which normally displayed a beautiful map of smoothly moving green dots, had turned entirely blood red. Brad Vance stood right in the center of the overwhelming chaos, his expensive, custom-tailored suit suddenly looking completely out of place. His sleek digital tablet was vibrating endlessly with catastrophic error reports and furious, threatening messages from the board of directors. His perfect, arrogant composure had completely shattered into a million pieces. "Fix it right now," Brad screamed at the top of his lungs, violently slamming both of his hands down on a nearby desk, shattering a plastic coffee mug. I do not care what you have to do or how much overtime it takes. Hack into our own network and force the routing software back online immediately. He had forcefully dragged the entire senior information technology department, along with the 4 terrified college interns he had hired to replace me, into a frantic, hyperventilating emergency response huddle. The lead systems engineer, a seasoned veteran programmer who knew far better than to mess with strict federal protocols, was pale and sweating profusely. He frantically typed lines of code into a heavy diagnostic terminal, his hands visibly shaking over the keyboard. "We cannot just hack it, Brad," the lead engineer shouted back, desperately trying to make the stubborn vice president understand the sheer gravity of the legal situation. "This is not some cheap, outsourced cloud software that crashed because of a bad automatic update. The system is not broken at all. It is functioning flawlessly. It is operating exactly according to strict federal law. It detected a missing senior authorization and triggered a mandatory legal quarantine. We are totally locked out by military-grade encryption." Brad aggressively grabbed the engineer by the shoulder, his face turning a dangerous, volatile shade of crimson. "Then bypass the authorization, build a bridge over it, write a back door, do whatever it takes to get those 4,000 trucks moving before the federal government finds this entire company into total bankruptcy." "There are absolutely no back doors in Department of Transportation compliance systems," the engineer yelled, finally losing his temper and shoving Brad's hand away. "Without the master authentication tokens, the software legally cannot generate the hazardous permits. Nobody in this entire building has the administrative rights to override a biometric failsafe except the original architect, and you just fired her 2 weeks ago without a transition plan." The 4 young college interns stood cramped in the corner, practically paralyzed by fear. One of them, a young woman who had spent the entire morning desperately trying to decipher my final transition logs, timidly raised her hand. "Mr. Vance," she stammered, her voice trembling violently over the deafening roar of the frantic office floor. "I just checked the deep system security logs. The biometric timer officially expired this morning because the 14-day handover window was breached without a valid transfer of credentials. The primary digital activation codes have been permanently scrambled by the server." Brad stared at her, his eyes wide with a rising, suffocating terror. "What does that mean? Stop using tech jargon and give it to me in plain English." "It means the digital system absolutely cannot be recovered from the inside," the intern explained, backing away slowly as if Brad might explode. "The only possible way to manually reboot the compliance engine and satisfy the federal government is to manually input the backup emergency cipher codes. The system log clearly states that those exact codes were printed out and physically handed directly over to you during the standard exit protocol. There is only one single physical copy in existence." A dead, horrifying silence suddenly fell over the immediate group. Even as the rest of the massive office continued to burn down around them, every single pair of eyes slowly turned to look directly at Brad. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin looking as pale as a ghost. He slowly turned his head, his breathing shallow and erratic, and looked through the clear glass walls of his pristine, ultra-modern corner office. Sitting right there on his expensive glass desk, quietly holding up his massive, ultra-wide computer monitor, was the gigantic, heavy hardcover manual I had handed to him exactly 14 days ago. The very book he had ruthlessly mocked, the very book he had absolutely refused to read. The absolute only thing on this earth that could save the billion-dollar logistics empire from total, spectacular destruction was currently being used to keep his neck from getting stiff. The realization hit him with the crushing, unstoppable force of a runaway freight train. He had not just ignored the critical warning, he had literally built his own execution block and proudly rested his daily work right on top of it. Within 4 hours of the catastrophic system failure, Chief Executive Officer Marcus Thorne aborted his luxury golf retreat in Europe and chartered a private jet straight back to the Chicago headquarters. By early afternoon, he had summoned an emergency, life-or-death meeting in the Grand Executive Boardroom. The atmosphere was incredibly toxic, filled with the panicked shouting of major corporate shareholders and the terrified whispers of the highest-paid defense lawyers in the city. Marcus sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his face buried in his hands, completely overwhelmed by the financial bleeding that was currently draining millions of dollars from their operating accounts with every passing hour. Brad Vance stood at the far end of the room, sweating profusely, his custom-tailored suit completely wrinkled. He was frantically trying to defend his disastrous operational choices, loudly insisting that the system failure was an unpredictable glitch. But the corporate legal team was already 10 steps ahead of his pathetic lies. The head of corporate compliance stood up, her face entirely devoid of any sympathy, and activated the massive digital projector, displayed brightly on the wall, in font large enough for every single furious investor to read, was the exact email I had sent at precisely 5 o'clock on my final day. This document proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Stella Chavez executed a 100% compliant transition, the head lawyer announced, her voice echoing coldly across the silent room. She documented every single federal regulation, handed over the physical master encryption tokens, and explicitly warned Vice President Vance about the mandatory 14-day biometric renewal window. We did not just lose our compliance architect. We actively threw away our only legal lifeline because our Vice President of Operations refused to read a transition manual. Brad opened his mouth to argue, completely desperate to shift the massive blame, but before he could utter a single word, the heavy double doors of the executive boardroom were violently shoved open. Everyone froze as a highly coordinated team of serious men and women in dark windbreakers marched straight into the room. The gold federal badges clipped to their belts caught the harsh fluorescent light. At the front of the formation stood Special Agent Miller from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. He did not ask for permission to enter, and he certainly did not care about the billions of dollars represented by the men sitting at that table. This entire corporate facility is now under a strict federal lockdown, Agent Miller announced, his booming voice completely shattering whatever was left of the executive authority in the room. Nobody makes a phone call, nobody touches a single computer terminal, and nobody leaves this building. We are initiating a comprehensive, immediate federal inspection of Ethereum Freight Solutions under severe suspicion of deliberate hazardous transport fraud and criminal evasion of federal safety protocols. The major shareholders gasped in pure horror. The word criminal instantly changed the entire landscape of the disaster. This was no longer just a massive financial headache. This was a direct path to federal prison. Completely backed into a corner and rapidly losing his mind, Brad Vance pointed a trembling finger toward the empty chair where I used to sit. He unleashed a frantic, desperate tirade, his voice cracking under the crushing pressure. "It was not me," Brad screamed, looking wildly at the federal agents. "It was the former architect, Stella Chavez. She is a disgruntled employee. She deliberately planted malicious software into our main servers right before she resigned. She intentionally designed a digital trap to sabotage our national freight network and extort this company for millions of dollars. You have to arrest her." Special Agent Miller did not even blink at the hysterical outburst. He slowly unzipped his heavy leather briefcase, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and walked directly over to Brad. With a loud, decisive slap, the federal agent slammed the paper down onto the polished mahogany table. It was a direct photocopy of the mandatory exit compliance receipt. At the very bottom of the page, in bold blue ink, was Brad Vance's undeniable, rushed signature, legally confirming he had received the Master Federal Safety Manual and fully accepted the responsibility of maintaining the government licenses. "We already pulled the transition logs from your local servers, Mr. Vance," Agent Miller stated, staring at Brad with an absolutely chilling level of professional disgust. "Ms. Chavez did exactly what federal law required her to do. She properly secured a highly sensitive hazardous materials network, handed the legal keys directly to you, and documented the entire exchange. You willingly accepted custody of a national security protocol and then actively chose to neglect it. That does not make her a saboteur. That makes you the primary suspect in a massive federal investigation for criminal obstruction of national transport security. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Marcus Thorne stared at the federal receipt, his eyes wide with the horrifying realization that his billion-dollar logistics empire was currently standing on the absolute brink of total bankruptcy, deeply entangled in a severe criminal prosecution. The sheer arrogance of his new leadership team had literally invited the federal government to tear his company apart piece by piece. Marcus slowly stood up from his chair. He did not look at the investors, and he did not speak to the federal agents. He fixed a gaze of pure, unfiltered hatred directly onto Brad Vance. "Security," Marcus growled, his voice trembling with an explosive mixture of rage and absolute despair. Two massive corporate security guards immediately stepped forward from the shadows of the boardroom. "Get this arrogant, incompetent fool out of my sight," the chief executive officer ordered, pointing a shaking hand at Brad. "Strip him of his digital access devices, confiscate his keys, and physically throw him out onto the street right now. If he ever sets foot within 500 yards of this building again, I want him arrested for trespassing." Brad tried to plead, crying out for a second chance, begging the investors to intervene. But nobody moved a single muscle. The security guards grabbed him tightly by both arms and forcefully dragged him out of the boardroom. The entire room watched in stunning, absolute silence as the hotshot executive from Silicon Valley, the man who had promised to modernize their entire world and completely eliminate the old guard, was violently ejected from the corporate headquarters in total disgrace. The arrogant king of automation had just been completely destroyed by the very analog rules he had refused to respect. The warm ocean breeze was sweeping across my private balcony in Miami when my personal cell phone began to ring. I took a slow, relaxing sip of my ice-cold margarita, gently placed the salted glass down on the small table, and looked at the caller identification. It was the private number of Chief Executive Officer Marcus Thorne. I smiled, swiped the screen, and calmly placed the device on speakerphone. "Stella, please tell me you are listening," Marcus pleaded, his voice completely stripped of its usual commanding billionaire authority. He sounded out of breath, frantic, and utterly terrified. "I am begging you. You need to get on the next flight back to Chicago right now. The federal government has locked down our entire headquarters. Brad is gone. I threw him out. I need you to unlock the routing network and testify to the federal agents that our compliance architecture is secure. Name your price, Stella. Whatever you want. Just come back to your job." I leaned back in my lounge chair, watching a massive white cruise ship slowly move across the turquoise horizon. "Marcus, I am afraid you are deeply misunderstanding the current legal situation," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly pleasant and entirely unbothered. "I cannot come back to my job because you no longer have a compliance department. When your executive team unilaterally terminated my position as the routing architect, you did not just lose an employee. You lost the only active federal hazardous materials compliance specialist certificate in your entire corporate portfolio, because that specific government license is legally registered exclusively to my personal name." I paused for a second, letting the crushing reality of that statement sink into his panicking mind. "As of right now, I am the only registered independent contractor in the entire United States who possesses the exact security clearances and biometric authorizations required to untangle this catastrophic mess with the Department of Transportation within the next 24 hours. I am no longer your subordinate. Marcus, I am your absolute only available federal lifeline." There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end of the line, broken only by his heavy, desperate breathing. He knew I had him completely cornered. "What are your terms?" he finally whispered in absolute defeat. "I will email you an independent emergency consulting contract," I stated firmly, having already drafted the document days ago. "My immediate retainer fee will be exactly 20 times my previous annual salary, payable upfront via an instant wire transfer. Furthermore, I require 5% of total non-voting company shares transferred directly into my portfolio. Once the funds officially clear into my bank account, I will remotely authenticate the network and speak with the federal agents to lift the quarantine. Marcus did not argue. He did not try to negotiate or threaten me with corporate legal action because he knew his empire would completely evaporate by tomorrow morning if he refused. "Send the contract," he said, his voice entirely hollow. 10 minutes later, my digital tablet chimed with a secure corporate signature. 5 minutes after that, a massive, life-changing sum of money successfully deposited directly into my personal checking account. I opened my laptop, securely connected to the federal portal, and remotely authorized a temporary 72-hour compliance unlock for their national network. Before closing my computer to enjoy the rest of my sunny afternoon, I typed out a very short, final text message directly to Marcus. "The system has been remotely activated for a temporary unlock. Next time, do not use federal documents as a monitor stand. Thank you so much. Everyone, for listening to my story today. I would love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from right now? If you found today's corporate revenge story entertaining and satisfying, please help us keep going by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon. By joining, you can listen to our absolute best, most detailed exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can easily support us by scanning the quick response code right here on your screen, or by using the Patreon link located in the video description or the pinned comment below. Thank you again, and always remember your true worth.